There's a peculiar story surrounding the Montrose Air Station, a former RAF station in Scotland used throughout World War I and II. One of the ghosts said to haunt the area doesn't even have a name. Nobody remembers who he was, just that he was a strict, hard guy, the kind of officer who barked at subordinates and threw his weight around. He died in a crash, seconds after taking off from the airfield. The whispers around how, and importantly why, haven't stopped since. But now, he's said to still stride around the airfield, looking for those who wronged him, terrifying anyone living who crosses his path. And he's not the only one. There's another entity people talk about, seen by multiple witnesses, reliving his final, fatal flight. So it seems that Montrose Airfield has seen war, loss, and plenty of strange things that never made it into the official records. So Montrose Airfield is located on the east coast of Scotland, and back in 1912 it was one of 12 sites chosen by the newly formed Royal Flying Corps to set up their air stations. The Royal Flying Corps would later become the Royal Air Force, the RAF, a little bit later down the line in 1918. And Montrose was actually the first of these 12 air stations, making it the first operational military air station in Britain, so there's a bit of a claim to fame. But it was a strategically important one, as having an RFC station here meant that aircraft could better protect the multiple Royal Navy bases that were nearby, something that Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, had requested. And the Montrose site that was first established, that actually wasn't quite where it sits today. It was supposed to be a little bit south of the town of Montrose at Upper Dysart Farm, and the reason that it was moved was because on the 26th of February 1913, the aircraft from No. 2 Squadron of the RFC landed at the Upper Dysart site, but the commanding officer at the time, Major Charles Burke, he wasn't a fan. Conditions were not the most ideal, so surely there's got to be a better spot for this air station, right? So he went out to try and find somewhere better, and that's when he identified the site to the north of the town. It was near a railway line, it was flat, it had good drainage, in line with the wind direction. It seemed perfect. Thanks, we'll take it. He was granted permission to relocate the air station, and after the hangars were put up at the end of 1913, No. 2 Squadron moved into their new home in the new year of 1914. And just in the nick of time really, as the First World War was right around the corner. On the 3rd of August 1914, the day before Britain entered the war, No. 2 Squadron flew from Montrose to Farnborough, where they would be the first RFC squadron deployed to France. While they never returned to Montrose, and not in a, oh, they never made it home kind of way, they just didn't go back there, the air station went on to play a big role for other squadrons, as well as being a major training site for not only British pilots, but also for Americans and Canadians preparing to fight on the Western Front. But once the Great War was over, by about 1920, there was much less of a need to train pilots, and so RAF Montrose closed down. 4 years later though, the air station had a new job, with the hangars that Major Burke had built, being used as a bit of a workshop, maintaining and refurbishing Lewis machine guns. But by 1935, with the threat from Germany growing again, the RAF decided to start ramping things up and was therefore in need of more military-trained pilots. And so on the 1st of January 1936, RAF Montrose was reopened as No. 8 Flying Training School. Throughout the course of World War II, hundreds of pilots trained, served and earned their wings here from all sorts of Allied nations. There were detached flights of Hurricanes and Spitfires here that were used as part of the air defence for Edinburgh, which is about 60 miles as the crow flies southwest of Montrose. On the 25th of October 1940 though, RAF Montrose was hit when 3 German Junkers Ju-88 aircraft dropped 24 bombs on the station. 5 people were killed and 18 were injured, while 2 hangars and the officers' mess were destroyed. Later on, in 1944, one of the teams from the newly formed RAF Mountain Rescue Service was stationed here as well, as there were a lot of mountains further inland and aircraft crashes in that terrain weren't exactly rare, unfortunately, but they were only here for a few months. After World War II, No. 63 Maintenance Unit was stationed here, where the aircraft to be repaired had to be brought in by road, they couldn't just fly in. The reason being that during this time, aircraft were getting bigger and more powerful, and they needed more than just the grass landing strip that was there. In 1949, the Mountain Rescue Service came back to RAF Montrose, but other than that, at this point in time, activity was pretty minimal here. Certainly not like it had been during the World Wars. At the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, No. 63 military maintenance unit had a little bit more to do, more aircraft to repair and whatnot, but the age for RAF Montrose was kind of really over. The space was just too small, it was too old. The jet aircraft needed proper tarmac runways, not grass. Even the Sommerfeld matting, the metal mesh tracking put down on the landing strip, just to help reinforce the grass, that was deteriorating. And so on the 4th of June 1952, RAF Montrose closed permanently, with the mountain rescue team moving out the year after too. And for the next few decades, that was more or less it. In the 80s though, a group of local enthusiasts banded together to form the Montrose Air Station Heritage Trust, which later became known as the Ian McIntosh Memorial Trust after the guy who led the efforts. Through fundraising with the Montrose Aerodrome Museum Society, the trust was able to purchase the watch office, basically the control tower, and a section of the old airfield. And from there, they opened up the Montrose Air Station Heritage Centre as a museum. Over the years, they expanded and restored more buildings on the old RAF station, and nowadays, they have a range of different aircraft on display. Major Burke's sheds, the original hangars from 1913, they're still there. Plus they have a bunch of different artefacts and things. Looks like a really neat afternoon out, to be fair. But as you're walking around, reading the displays and looking at the aircraft, it can be quite hard to really place yourself in the midst of what RAF Montrose would have been like at its peak as a training facility. You would have had the war looming over you, so there's that, but also it's a flight training school, and so plane crashes were an inevitable part of that. There was a bit of a saying back in the day that there was a crash every day and a funeral every week, and while I think that that might have taken a little bit of artistic licensing, the fact is that crashes and deaths did happen here, with many of those airmen buried nearby at Sleepy Hillock Cemetery. The Aviation Safety Network, the database of aircraft crashes, says that 16 men died in and around Montrose. And so with the fact that many young lives were lost here, often suddenly, pretty violently, not even mentioning the ones who left and never made it back home, it's maybe not surprising that ghost stories soon started to surface. The most famous was that of a man who was killed before World War I even began. Actually, before the air station was even established at its current location. Because on the 27th of May 1913, Lieutenant Desmond Arthur, a pilot with the Royal Flying Corps, he took off from Upper Dysart in his BE-2 biplane, number 205, on a routine training flight over Montrose. At about 7:30 in the morning, as he was starting his descent, witnesses on the ground saw the biplane's right wing fold upwards on itself, and the aircraft started plummeting to the ground. Lieutenant Desmond Arthur was thrown from the falling plane after his seatbelt snapped, with people claiming that he fell noiselessly to the floor, landing about 150 metres from the wreckage. He had died instantly on impact. He was buried at Sleepy Hillock Cemetery in Montrose around the 30th of May, and the initial report into the disaster on the 21st of June 1913 ruled that a broken spar hadn't been repaired properly. And so that's one of the main supporting beams within the wing of the plane. Kind of very important. It came out that this plane had been built in June 1912, and in August, so a couple of months later, it had had a minor accident, and the repair job had been botched. Kinda done on the down low, very hush-hush, hadn't been reported. It was nothing malicious, it wasn't sabotage or anything like that. It was just enough to avoid detection before No. 2 Squadron had flown from Farnborough up to their new base in Scotland. And so that was the reason for the catastrophic failure up in the sky. And after that initial report came out, that was that. Lieutenant Desmond Arthur had been buried with full military honours, and it was obviously a sad occasion, but that was just the nature of the beast. That all changed though when over 3 years later, on the 3rd of August 1916, an official investigation by a government committee overturned that initial report. They said that it wasn't the result of any failure with the plane. Plane had been fine. It was actually because Lieutenant Desmond Arthur had been flying recklessly, and his pilot error had caused the crash. Almost immediately, this brought about uproar amongst pilots in the RFC, especially those who had known Desmond. They were not happy. They knew it was nothing to do with him. Witnesses on the ground had seen the wing break in real time, and now some government report was going to besmirch the good name of the lieutenant. By this point, the Royal Flying Corps had moved the air station to Montrose, and it was now this busy training facility. And because of that, there were a lot of people living on site, including a Major Cyril Foggin, who was a senior flight instructor. One evening in the autumn of 1916, Major Foggin was was walking to the officers' mess, just going to get some food. He just so happened to look up and notice that there was a guy wearing a pilot's uniform walking in front of him, going in the same direction as him, so walking towards the mess. Only when he reached the doors, the figure vanished into thin air. There was nowhere for him to have gone, no way he could have ducked out of sight or hidden anywhere, and Major Foggin would have noticed if he'd have opened the doors ahead of them. So that was a super weird experience for him, but he just, kind of brushed off the encounter. It could be that he's overtired, he's hallucinating, he's been working long hours. Yeah, that's gotta be it, right? So he didn't mention what he'd seen to anyone. Not forgetting, it is 1916 and he's in a pretty high up position. You don't want to jeopardise that by saying that you're seeing things that aren't there now, And so that was that, he just kept it to himself. But then other officers started talking about seeing something strange. One said he was woken up in the middle of the night and saw the figure of a man sitting at the end of his bed just watching him. Not okay. And so the officer started to get up out of the bed, demanding, "Who the bloody hell are you? What are you doing in my quarters?" and all of that. Reasonable questions to ask, given the situation. Only this figure never said a word, only got up from where he was sitting and vanished into thin air. Only then did Major Foggin feel a little bit more comfortable sharing what he'd experienced, and apparently actually went on to see this ghostly pilot 5 more times after his initial encounter. The rumours were rife across the air station, as apparently it wasn't just officers who were seeing this figure. It got so much that in late 1916, a guy called C.G. Gray, the editor of the Aeroplane magazine and a friend of Lieutenant Desmond Arthur's, he wrote a piece claiming that the ghost supposedly haunting Montrose Air Station was none other than his late friend, who was appearing now over 3 years after his death because he needed to clear his name. Desmond knew that he wasn't to blame for the crash and he didn't want people thinking that it was his fault. A speculation that, potentially, may have been right on the money, really. As after that damning report had come out in August, there was another, final report that was dated the 17th of November 1916, but it didn't actually go out until around Christmas time. And this report effectively backtracked on what the August report had said and went some way to clearing Lieutenant Desmond Arthur's name. And interestingly, after this third report came out, it seemed like his spirit had done its job. The last time Major Foggin saw the apparition was Christmas Eve 1916. There had been a Christmas party on in the officers' mess, and as Major Foggin and 2 other instructors walked across the room, they all saw the dark-haired figure of a man with his back to them. He was stood facing the fire with a grey helmet on and a flying coat hanging loose from his shoulders. All 3 men stopped to stare at the figure, and they watched as he threw some papers onto the fire before dematerialising. And I really do like that story though, almost as if, well, my job here is done, people don't think I was a prat and that's the reason that I died, so now it's time to get rid of these reports and rest in peace. Maybe, potentially, as even aside from having his name cleared, he was apparently still seen from time to time. Once the air station reopened in 1924, there was an RAF policeman on patrol around the base one night called Norrie Webster. He claimed that everything was fine, everything was totally normal, until he started to hear the unmistakable sounds of footsteps. Obviously, he went to go and check it out, see who was sneaking around when there shouldn't be anyone there, but he never found a living soul. So that was that, until a few nights later, another officer who had been on patrol also heard the footsteps, and went even further to say that he had actually seen a strange mist too. And then there was another story, which said that another guard on patrol one foggy evening had passed by a man wearing a flying suit. The guy hadn't even looked at him, didn't say a thing, just marched past. Initially, the guard didn't think a huge amount of it, until he realised that, number 1, it's far too foggy to fly, and number 2, no one's even flying right now. The air station is being used to refurbish Lewis machine guns at that point. There shouldn't be anyone dressed in flying gear. But then, once World War II broke out, there was a very interesting story. Not on the ground this time though, but up in the air above Montrose. One night in 1940, reports came in of a Heinkel bomber that had been spotted in the local area. And so in response, a hurricane was called out to try and spot them. This pilot, he was flying around, but couldn't spot the Heinkel at all. After about 30 minutes, he received word over the radio to say, "Alright, let's call it there, just come back to land." Because they were obviously responding to reports that there might be enemy aircraft nearby, they weren't about to go and light up the landing strip just in case there was something out there, who would obviously then be able to see clearly where RAF Montrose was and get a direct hit on it. No problem for this hurricane pilot though. He'd flown at night loads before, was super experienced, he knew his job. As he came into land, everything was looking spot on. The ground crew could kind of see his approach even in the darkness. They heard him ease off the throttle, all fine, until at the last second the pilot gunned the engine and flew back up into the air, effectively aborting the landing. The guys on the ground were a bit confused, like, okay. Maybe he spotted the hindcull at the last second and now he's in pursuit? But no, the hurricane circled round and attempted to land again. And again, everything was looking perfect until the last second he aborted. This time they thought, okay, something's going on here, and so they took the risk and lit up the airfield, and the pilot was able to make a textbook landing. As soon as he was parked up, the pilot was seething, absolutely furious, going off about who on earth was that madman in the biplane, as twice he'd almost crashed into him as he'd been trying to land. Everyone looked a bit confused. No one had seen anything other than the hurricane, but the pilot was adamant he had seen a biplane and it had forced him to abort the landing twice, which was most odd as this hurricane pilot had been the only one in the air. And besides, they didn't even have any biplanes at the air station. But this wasn't the only story of this seemingly phantom biplane being seen. In 1942, two airmen who were on night watch duty ran back to their commander, saying that they needed to mobilise help. They had just witnessed an aircraft come down and crash into a burst of flames on the beach. When the area was searched though, they didn't find a single trace of any crash. No unaccounted for planes, no wreckage, nothing. But then in 1963, so well after Montrose had officially closed down, a guy called Sir Peter Masefield, the former chief executive of British European Airways, one of the airlines that eventually merged and became British Airways, he had a very weird encounter. He was just about to get into his light aircraft, a chipmunk called Tango Mike, which was parked at Dalcross, now Inverness Airport. And it was relatively early in the morning, no one was really about, but just as he was doing his pre-flight checks and working out fuel and all of that, a man approached him, asking if he could get a ride down south. As Peter looked up at the guy, he saw that he was short, quite skinny, and was wearing one of those vintage flying jackets. Peter said, sure, you know what, glad of the company, hop in, kind of thing. They got going, took off, everything was great. Peter had tried to make conversation with his passenger, but he wasn't really getting anything back from him. He just assumed that maybe the guy hadn't flicked the switch to allow him to communicate through the headset, just something trivial like that. Peter did look behind him multiple times during the flight though, and could see this guy just peering about, looking pretty content. As they passed over Montrose, a biplane came into view. Sir Peter, he's an aviation man through and through, and he recognised it as a BE-2 plane. They got closer because the Chipmunk was a little bit faster, until the biplane was only about 200 yards away from the Chipmunk. At that point though, Peter watched as one of the biplane's wings folded upwards on itself, just like a sickening, instant, that shouldn't be there kind of sight. The biplane's nose jerked up and then turned down as the aircraft started falling towards the ground, with the pilot in free fall. At that point, the scene disappeared under the nose of the Chipmunk, so Peter lost sight of it all. But at that very moment, a most gut-wrenching, heartbreaking wail of despair came through his headset. He turned to look at this mysterious companion to find that the seat was empty. There was no one there. Okay, just witnessed a plane crash and now my passenger's missing. Kinda creeped out now. Peter landed at Montrose, sort of like got safe, parked up and all of that, and then peered back at the seat that had definitely been occupied by someone, but there was no one there. The harness was still fastened and the headset was laid neatly on the seat, still plugged in, but with all the switches turned off. Turning his attention back to the air disaster he'd seen play out, he went to go and get help, but no one else had seen the crash. They'd seen Tango Mike flying past, but no biplane and certainly no crash. Peter refueled and made it back home, but when he went to write the incident in his logbook, he noted the date, the 27th of May, 1963, exactly 50 years to the day of Lieutenant Desmond Arthur's fatal crash. And so that definitely sounds like a residual echo of that horrendous crash still replaying. Could it be that Lieutenant Desmond Arthur's ghost has also now carried on as a more residual haunting, still being seen walking around Montrose, just like that guard saw on that foggy evening? Because there have been plenty more stories of a ghostly airman still wandering around. Or is it someone else? Because after 1942, there was a surge in sightings of a phantom figure in a flying jacket and goggles seen. And a lot of people believe that this wasn't Lieutenant Desmond Arthur at all. It was someone else. Because there was a story that in 1942 there was a flight lieutenant who had a bit of a reputation. He was known to be incredibly harsh, a stickler for the rules, but also he would just fly off the handle at the smallest little thing. He would just take things way too far. He was a very angry man, and so because of that, he was really just not well liked. One day, he was spotted screaming at a mechanic, just tearing this poor guy a new one, and the interaction ended when the flight lieutenant put the mechanic on a charge. Basically, an official write-up for misconduct, for breaking the rules, part of the disciplinary process. A week after this incident, this same mechanic was assigned a job on the aircraft that the flight lieutenant flew quite often. Needed just a little bit of work doing. The mechanic did his job, it was all signed off, all good, and the flight lieutenant got in the aircraft to go and fly it. Seconds after takeoff, the aircraft crashed back down into the ground, and the flight lieutenant was killed instantly. An investigation was obviously launched, and it was kind of unofficially whispered about that maybe that mechanic had had something to do with it. The flight lieutenant's confrontation the week before hadn't exactly been done in private, but no evidence was found of any tampering or anything like that, and that was the end of it. But soon after the flight lieutenant's death, the ghostly figure of a man wearing a flying jacket and goggles started to be seen around the air station, leading some people to believe that the furious pilot had returned after death, seeking out justice for the mechanic who may or may not have sabotaged him. A woman who was making tea in the naffy, basically like the canteen area, she claimed that there was one time when a man fully kitted out in flight gear walked into the room. When she tried to speak to him, offer him a cup of tea that she had just made, he vanished in front of her. In 1946, there was a serviceman who was newly stationed at Montrose, and he'd seen combat all over the place. He was very experienced, and so when he was told about the ghost stories, he just kind of laughed it off, like, yeah, sure. He was assigned guard duty, and on his shift, at about 3 in the morning, him and his partner decided, yeah, you know what, now is a good time to have a cigarette break. They decided one would go around the corner, have their cigarette, come back, and then the other one would go and do the same. This serviceman's mate goes off to have his smoke first, leaving the guy all alone, about between where the control tower and the morgue were. And like I say, it's 3 in the morning, everywhere is all locked up, there is not a soul about. Suddenly, as the guy was standing there, alone, the doors to the morgue flew open, and out walked a man wearing his full flying uniform, complete with goggles. The way he just flung those doors open and started striding out of there, that man was on a mission. In absolute shock and disbelief, the guard dropped his rifle. He was just so bewildered by what he was seeing. But the second that the morgue doors swung back shut again, the figure was gone. Completely dematerialised, just not there anymore. Speechless. Utterly speechless. I think it took a while for that serviceman to actually admit to that story too. He certainly didn't tell his guard duty partner about it when he'd came back from smoking. Apparently, it later came out that the morgue had once been used as the old operations room, and so the story eventually became that it was that angry flight lieutenant. He wasn't storming out of the morgue for whatever reason, he was reliving his final moments. Bursting through those doors, after possibly receiving orders from the ops room, just like he did that day, heading for his aircraft, minutes before his violent death. The figure was seen again in September 1947, when another guard witnessed this figure, all decked out in his flying uniform, while he was out on patrol around the air station. But with this grisly flight lieutenant's story, there is always a bit of an eyebrow raise when you don't have a name attached to the story. I did have a little bit of a look, and there were 2 fatal crashes that I could find around Montrose in 1942. The first was on the 24th of March, when Sergeant George Kenneth McRae lost his life, and then the second was on the 11th of September, when Flight Sergeant Frederick Thomas Martin died. So they are the wrong rank, and also I didn't get any details about how either of these 2 men were killed. Plus, all of the sources that I found that covered this story said that the flight lieutenant's name hadn't even been released from the records, so I don't know. But even so, there are so many more witness accounts of seeing ghostly airmen here. 2 more servicemen who were on guard duty both claimed to see a figure walking towards them. When they challenged him, he didn't stop, he didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge their presence, and they quickly figured out that this guy wasn't an intruder, he wasn't even living. Another guard watched in horror as the figure of a pilot walked straight through a metal fence, as if it wasn't even there. But even in the years since RAF Montrose shut down, others have seen this figure too. A civilian was walking across the airfield when he passed a man wearing flying clothes, walking the other way, looking like he was on his way to get into an aircraft kind of thing. The civilian made the most British comment ever and just mentioned about the weather, how it was lovely and pleasant, to which the pilot said nothing, completely ignored him. And so this guy, he just kind of like looked over his shoulder at the direction the pilot was going in, but there was absolutely no one there. Not a single other living soul in sight. The pilot had just gone, and there was nowhere that anyone could have run off to and hidden. This guy had just dematerialized. And then even now, as a museum, this figure has been seen. A volunteer came face to face with a man dressed in old-fashioned flying gear on the 14th of May 2018. 2 years prior to that encounter, in 2016, another volunteer claimed to see a pilot walk out of this strange mist and head straight through a wall in the old headquarters building. Were any of these encounters with the angry flight lieutenant, wandering the old air station, still searching for the vindication that Desmond Arthur eventually got? Or was it Lieutenant Desmond Arthur himself continuing to hang around, even though his name was eventually cleared? Or, and hold on to your hats kids, could it be someone else entirely? Because there were only a couple of mentions of this, but that was more than one and that was enough for me. On the old version of the Montrose Air Station Museum website, there was a line about the ghost, only his name wasn't Desmond Arthur, and it wasn't the flight lieutenant who had died in 1942. It was a man called Fergie Waldron, or Major FF Waldron, I found written somewhere else, and this man had died in France in 1916, but had returned to Montrose. Doing a little bit of internet sleuthing, I found the name of a Major Francis Fitzgerald Waldron, who died in France in 1916, which is also now where he's buried. So just taking a step back and thinking about this from a different angle, could it be that Desmond Arthur's ghost really did just vanish after his name was cleared, and then all that was left after that of him was the residual haunting of his biplane going down? And maybe those strange encounters reported in the years between the World Wars, where guards would see a figure in flight gear, were actually Major Waldron. According to the story, the unnamed pilot didn't die until 1942, so it couldn't have been him being seen in that interwar period. Although I have no idea how Major Waldron came to be a ghost story at Montrose, how they know it's him, why he came back if he's laid to rest in the cemetery in France. So that might be an interesting avenue to look down if you fancy looking into it further. Or, to muddy the waters even more, just because I seem to enjoy confusing the heck out of myself if things aren't adding up, was it someone else entirely? There are over 80 graves of airmen at Sleepy Hillock Cemetery. Multiple fatalities occurred in the area. There was also one brief alternative story that I only saw in one place, saying that the ghost was actually a trainee pilot who was made to go on a training flight, even though he didn't feel very well, and that he actually ended up passing away. But that's all I've got on that one. Whoever he is though, if it is just one guy, or if it's multiple ghostly airmen wandering around Montrose Air Station, the sightings did get so frequent at one point that new servicemen posted to RAF Montrose were actually briefed about the ghost. And if guards on night watch did abandon their post because they'd seen something unexplainable, well, apparently they weren't reprimanded to the fullest extent. Allegedly. If someone was based at RAF Montrose and can confirm or deny that bit, that would be very interesting to know. But aside from the phantom servicemen, there were other instances of general weirdness supposedly going on at Montrose, with some even happening to this day. The sound of an airplane engine has been heard, flying low, coming into land, but there's nothing around for miles. And even back in 1943, a NAFI employee swore that she heard the sound of a plane coming into land, and so she went and got a cup of tea ready, but no plane landed, no pilot arrived for his cuppa. But sometimes the engine isn't heard, but the phantom plane is actually seen. There was one instance in 1987 where a woman who was driving near the closed down air station looked over and saw a khaki and greenish kind of coloured plane flying super low to the ground, almost like it was coming into land. However, it was completely silent. The woman later identified the plane that she had seen as a Hurricane, one of which, interestingly enough, had crashed here on the night of the 8th of April 1941. It went down while trying to land, and the pilot, Sergeant John Herbert Allen of the RNZAF, Royal New Zealand Air Force, was killed. Inside the air station, doors fly open on their own, or they'll be seen furiously rattling, as if someone is on the other side, desperately trying to get out. Only of course, there never is anyone there. Some people also claim to smell a super strong whiff of aviation fuel, but then it disappears as soon as they smell it. I don't know, could that one just be that a drop was spilled however long ago? I don't know how long those smells sort of last, just a faint whiff every now and then. Disembodied footsteps, that's a relatively common occurrence, as one guy on Night Watch found out. His story, oh man, I don't know. He started hearing these footsteps, and so he went towards them, assuming he was eventually going to come across an intruder. Only thing was, as he got closer to the sound, the footsteps stopped, turned around, and started striding towards him. Not okay with this. The footsteps got super close, and he was just shining his torch around, but he couldn't see anything. The footsteps were being caused by something unseen. No, thank you! Hushed conversations have also been heard in empty rooms, but then there was a story from a woman who was walking her dog on the site in 1990. She claimed that she heard a voice exclaim right next to her out of nowhere that said, "I'm here," 4 times. No one around, nowhere for anyone to hide, again, nothing like that. There was also a really interesting story around a particular wireless radio that was on display at the museum. In 2008, this radio, that had no power, wasn't plugged in, hadn't been used in decades, sprang to life, with the sounds of wartime speeches from Winston Churchill and music by the Glenn Miller Orchestra, that classic 1940s vibe coming through. There was no explanation, the thing wasn't even connected to a power source, there was no conceivable reason why this was now broadcasting the sounds of wartime Britain. But apparently this happened multiple times that year, before again falling silent. And so if you visit nowadays, I think you can still see this radio. I believe it is still on display. And just as an aside, you dog owners out there, as of right now, dogs are welcome at Montrose Air Station Museum, but if you notice a black Labrador who doesn't appear to have a human just following you around, he may not be flesh and blood. Because apparently there are stories of a phantom black Labrador who will follow staff and visitors around. It's thought that he was a station mascot from years gone by, but other than that we don't really have any more information. It reminds me a little bit of RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire, which is said to be haunted by the ghost of Guy Gibson's Labrador who was buried there. And if you don't know, Guy Gibson was the commanding officer of number 617 Squadron, the famous Dam Busters, but allegedly the ghost of a black Labrador isn't the only animal said to still be haunting Montrose. Back when paranormal investigations were allowed at the air station, because I don't think they allow them now, but anyway, back in 2004, the Ghost Club did an investigation there. They were there accompanied by a psychic medium, and this medium said that she could pick up on the presence of a monkey. Apparently, around 1942, there was a monkey at the RAF base, and they were called Dizzy, owned by Flight Sergeant Cyril Charles Herlock. I couldn't verify that myself, but the story of a monkey still hanging around the place, I thought that was just too interesting not to share. But the investigators did encounter something potentially darker, something that in its own strange way reflects the emotional weight of what happened here. Montrose during wartime wasn't just a place of training, it was a place where young men lived under pressure, under fear of constant risk, and where far too many didn't make it home. Among the evidence they collected, they captured EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, and some of the phrases were heavy. One voice seemed to say, "You have left us to die," and another said, "You have deserted us." Whether those words came from something paranormal or just the atmosphere, the energy of the place echoing back grief, it's kind of hard to say. I couldn't find any recordings to play back to you, so we have only got their word for it. But I think rounding it all off, it does really seem to drive home that for all the history that a place like Montrose Air Station holds, that history does come with pain. And so for all the paranormal activity at Montrose, was the angry World War II pilot responsible, stuck in a loop he never got to break? Was it Lieutenant Desmond Arthur, seemingly not at peace after all? Or maybe it was someone else entirely, another name on the list of lives cut short during wartime. Whatever the case, plenty of people have seen things here at Montrose Air Station, and the stories continue to this day. Even if the real planes have stopped flying overhead, you might find something else in their place instead. And so that is the story of Montrose Air Station Museum. An incredibly fascinating place that just got more frustrating the more I looked into it. It was one of those where the deeper you dig into the story, the more confusing it got. With the different ghostly airmen, who saw what and when, yada yada. But what really drew me in with this one in particular was that I saw some people saying that the ghost at Montrose was officially recognised by the RAF. I don't know what I was expecting, a press release saying there's a ghost here or something from the RAF, which for the record, I did not find. But I don't know if that officially recognised bit comes from the stories about new servicemen at Montrose supposedly getting briefed on what might happen on night watch. But if you've got a clearer answer than that, please do let me know and I will pin it in the comments. With all of these sightings of ghostly pilots in flying gear, that was a lot though, right? And when it comes to the so-called angry pilot, if that story is true, then without a name, we're probably never going to positively ID him. I did find it incredibly interesting to stumble across the older accounts mentioning a Major Francis Fitzgerald Waldron, especially with claims that he was seen too. But honestly, unless someone back then had noted down a really specific detail like a scar, a rank badge, literally anything to tell these figures apart, we'll probably never know who was who. If they were separate people, if they were in fact one and the same. But with the earliest witnesses to these paranormal encounters long departed from this world, that part of the story may be lost for good by now. Something that I didn't see mentioned anywhere though is the possibility that any of the paranormal activity is linked to the bombing that killed 5 men in 1940. That I'm sure would be traumatic enough to stir up ghosts. But as for Montrose Air Station Museum being haunted, I think it's a yes from me. The energy that would have been imprinted on the place, being such an important site during times of war, alongside all the death that has happened, both at the air station itself and elsewhere, with pilots not returning home from a mission and things like that, I think it is inevitable that there would be some weird encounters here. But let me know your thoughts. Have you visited here? Have you worked here? Have you experienced something a little strange? Do you think it's haunted? Do you think that it's people's imaginations running away with them, knowing the history? Tell me all of the things, all of the thoughts, all of the opinions, and if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. And if you'd like to hear more history behind the hauntings, I do this every week, so maybe you'd fancy subscribing and sticking around for another one sometime. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go and get a drink of water. Unless you've got a naffy girl ready with a cup of tea every time you land your fighter plane, I'm gonna need you to look after yourself. Stay hydrated. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. You would have had the war looming over you, so there's that. A lot of motorbikes out today.